I stood in the back corner of the conference room holding a folder I wasn't supposed to see. The leather binder felt heavier than its actual weight, thick with projections and legal language that most people would need 3 readings to understand. I'd absorbed it in one. The proposal detailed a merger worth $340 million. Morrison Global Consultancy, my sister's company, was being evaluated for acquisition. The acquiring entity was listed as Vision Corp Holdings, a name that appeared exactly once in the document's header and nowhere else, as if the company preferred to remain a whisper rather than a declaration. Vision Corp Holdings was mine. I'd built it over 12 years from insurance money and insider knowledge, structuring it through Delaware shells and trusted proxies until even forensic accountants would need weeks to trace ownership back to me. I controlled 73% of a firm now valued at $3.1 billion, and my sister Diana had no idea the woman she'd asked to organize paperwork was about to decide whether her life's work would continue to exist. Diana paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to her ear, her voice carrying that particular pitch of controlled urgency she used when she wanted people to know she was important. The late afternoon sun caught the edges of her tailored suit, charcoal with subtle pinstripes, the kind that cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her office occupied the 42nd floor of a midtown tower, all glass and steel and carefully curated minimalism. Abstract art that probably meant something to someone. A desk so clean it looked like a prop. Through the phone, I could hear only her side of the conversation, each word clipped and precise. Her lawyer, probably, or maybe the investment banker she'd hired to make this deal look more complicated than it actually was. The proposal sat on the conference table where Diana's assistant had left it during a bathroom break. I'd been asked to wait in the hall, but the door had been left ajar, and the folder had been positioned just visible enough to tempt curiosity. I'd glanced at it the way anyone would glance at something left carelessly open. Then I'd picked it up. Then I'd read every page. Diana pivoted toward the window, her free hand gesturing at nothing. Vision Corp's name had clearly rattled her. She'd researched us, obviously. Her type always did their homework, but she'd found only the surface details we allowed to exist. A CEO named Paul Richardson, a CFO named Catherine Park, a portfolio spanning government contracts, real estate, and selective private equity investments. No photographs of ownership, no interviews with founders, just results, year after year, quiet and relentless. She hung up and noticed me standing there. Her expression shifted from concentration to something adjacent to surprise, though she covered it quickly. "You're still here." Her tone wasn't rude. It was simply factual, the way someone might note that a lamp was still on or a window still open. I existed in her awareness as a background element, functional but forgettable. I gestured with the folder. This was on the table. She crossed the room in 4 strides and took it from my hands, her fingers closing around the leather with the kind of possessiveness people display toward things they've earned. Which, to be fair, she had. Morrison Global represented 15 years of 80-hour weeks and strategic ruthlessness. She'd built it from a one-person consultancy into a firm with offices in 3 cities and clients who paid 7 figures for advice on how to make their brands feel more human. "You shouldn't have touched that." I offered no apology, just a slight nod that acknowledged the boundary without conceding I'd crossed it intentionally. Her eyes narrowed for half a second, then released. I was her older sister, semi-retired, recently widowed, someone who lived in a modest house in Arlington and drove a car with 160,000 miles on it. She'd already calculated my threat level years ago and found it negligible. "I need you to organize the client files in the storage room. 2nd floor. They're a mess." Her assistant could have done that. Her assistant probably should have done that. But Diana had called me specifically, offering $35 an hour in cash, which she knew I wouldn't refuse because she thought I needed it. The truth was more complicated. I didn't need her money. I had more money than she'd earn in 3 lifetimes. But I needed to watch her, to see how she moved through the world when she thought no one important was paying attention. "I'll get started." She'd already turned back to her phone, scrolling through messages with the focused intensity of someone who believed the world would stop if she stopped monitoring it. I left the office and took the elevator down 2 floors, where the storage room smelled like old paper and the particular mustiness of spaces people only visited when they had to. The files were indeed a mess. I spent 90 minutes organizing them by year and client name, creating a system that would make sense to anyone who wasn't deliberately trying to obscure information. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. Catherine Park, my CFO, whose name appeared nowhere on my personal contacts, and whose calls came through a secure app that deleted message history automatically. The board reviewed Morrison's financials, strong growth, clean books. Her voice carried no inflection, just data delivered in the tone of someone who'd learned that emotion was a liability in rooms where decisions had consequences measured in millions. I kept my voice low, though the storage room was empty. Cultural assessment? We've scheduled due diligence meetings for next week. Paul will lead. I'll handle financials. You're listed as administrative support. Administrative support. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so precisely calculated. I'd be in the room where my sister pitched her company to my executives, and she'd think I was there to fetch coffee. Confirmed. Catherine paused, and I could hear the question she wasn't asking. She'd worked with me for 8 years. She understood that this wasn't standard protocol. Vision Corp didn't usually send the majority owner to observe acquisitions while pretending to be staff. But she also understood that questioning my methods wasn't part of her job description. Anything else you need from me? Just maintain the assessment framework. I want complete behavioral documentation. Understood. The call ended. I finished organizing the files and took a photo of the system I'd created, sending it to Diana with a brief message indicating the work was complete. She responded 7 minutes later with a thumbs-up emoji and a Venmo request for $245. I accepted it, watching the money transfer into an account I'd set up specifically for these kinds of transactions. The account currently held $600. My primary accounts held amounts that would have required scientific notation to express concisely. 2 weeks earlier, before I'd known about the Vision Corp proposal, Diana had hosted Sunday dinner at her Georgetown house. She did this monthly, a tradition she'd inherited from our mother and maintained with the kind of rigid consistency that substituted for actual warmth. The house itself was a 3-story renovation that had probably violated several historical preservation guidelines, but looked impressive in photographs. Exposed brick, reclaimed wood, a kitchen island large enough to host surgery. I'd arrived 20 minutes late because of traffic on the Roosevelt Bridge, which wasn't entirely true, but was plausible enough that no one questioned it. The truth was, I'd sat in my car for 15 minutes after parking, preparing myself for the performance these dinners required. Being invisible took more effort than people assumed. The front door was unlocked, which meant I was expected to let myself in. I could hear voices from the dining room. Diana's controlled modulation, Marcus's deeper bass, Jessica's occasional interjection pitched with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced significant failure. My mother Helen's laugh, warm and uncomplicated, the sound of someone who'd decided decades ago that some children succeeded and others simply existed, and that both outcomes were equally acceptable. I hung my coat on the rack near the door. The house smelled like rosemary and something caramelized, probably the pork tenderloin Diana made when she wanted to demonstrate that her professional success hadn't eliminated her ability to perform traditional femininity. They were already seated when I entered the dining room. Diana at the head of the table, naturally. Marcus to her right, Jessica beside him, Helen at the other end. A single empty chair remained, positioned near the kitchen, close enough to retrieve things when needed. Vicky. Marcus stood briefly, the kind of half-gesture men make when they've been taught manners but don't fully commit to them. You made it. The phrasing suggested my arrival had been uncertain, though I'd confirmed attendance 2 days prior. I slid into the empty chair and accepted the wine glass that appeared in front of me, poured by Diana from a bottle that probably cost more than my car payment. We were just talking about Diana's expansion plans. Helen's face carried the particular pride mothers reserve for children who've exceeded their early promise. Tell your sister. Diana set down her fork with the precision of someone who understood that even casual gestures could communicate status. We're acquiring a firm in London, boutique consultancy, very specialized. Jessica will manage the transition. Jessica smiled, the expression perfectly calibrated between humility and confidence. It's a great opportunity. Mom's trusting me with significant responsibility. She said this as if trust were something freely given, rather than something earned through proximity and shared DNA. I sipped wine and said nothing. Diana interpreted silence as agreement, which was convenient for both of us. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Diana discussed market positioning. Marcus mentioned something about regulatory frameworks. Jessica offered insights about European business culture that she'd probably gathered from 3 LinkedIn articles. Helen asked questions designed to showcase Diana's expertise rather than genuinely interrogate it. "You're quiet tonight." Marcus directed this observation at me with the tone of someone noticing a lamp had dimmed. "Everything okay?" "Just tired. Work's been busy." This was technically true. Vision Corp had closed 4 acquisitions in the past quarter, each requiring hundreds of hours of due diligence and integration planning. But I didn't explain that, because explaining would have required revealing what my work actually entailed. And I'd learned long ago that mystery was safer than clarity. "What are you working on these days?" Diana's question carried genuine curiosity, which made it more dangerous than dismissal. "You retired at 52. That's early even for federal employees." "Consulting, some advisory work." "For whom?" "Various clients, government contractors mostly, procurement efficiency." Diana nodded, and I watched her eyes perform the calculation. Government contractors meant small margins. Procurement efficiency meant administrative work. Various clients meant no one impressive enough to name. She just confirmed her existing assessment. Her older sister had failed to leverage decades of government experience into anything significant. That must be satisfying. Her voice carried the particular kindness people use when they want to acknowledge effort without validating results. Steady work, predictable income. Predictable. The word landed exactly where she'd aimed it. I'd spent 28 years at USAID climbing to GS-13, which sounded impressive until you understood that GS-13 was middle management with better benefits. I'd retired at 52 with a pension that covered basics and some consulting income that covered the rest. Diana earned more in a month than I'd earned in my best year with the government. She knew this because she'd asked once, directly, in the tone of someone confirming information she'd already estimated. Marcus refilled his wine glass and turned to Diana. "Tell them about Vision Corp." Diana's expression shifted into something I recognized from her client presentations. Controlled excitement wrapped in professional caution. She described the merger proposal, hitting the key points with the efficiency of someone who'd already rehearsed the story. The acquiring company was private equity, well-established but discreet. Their portfolio was impressive. Their terms were generous. The deal could triple Morrison Global's valuation overnight. They're based in Delaware. Shell company structure. Very mysterious. Marcus sounded impressed by this, as if opacity were a virtue rather than a strategic choice. Owners aren't public. Even their CEO is basically a ghost. "Who's the CEO?" Helen leaned forward, engaged now in a way she rarely was when I spoke. "Paul Richardson, mid-50s, Stanford MBA. Diana ticked off credentials like items on a grocery list. He's represented Vision Corp for 8 years, smart, professional, but definitely not the real power." "How do you know?" "Because real power doesn't need to be in the room." Diana said this with the certainty of someone who'd spent years studying how authority operated. Whoever owns Vision Corp has built something remarkable. 14 acquisitions in 8 years, all still operational. They don't gut companies. They scale them. I kept my expression neutral. While she described my work as if it belonged to someone else, she was right about the acquisitions, right about the operational continuity, right about the scaling strategy. But she was wrong about one critical detail. Real power was in the room. It just looked like someone who'd arrived late and was sitting too close to the kitchen. Jessica jumped in, her enthusiasm untempered by experience. "I researched their portfolio. It's incredible. Government IT contracts, commercial real estate, private equity investments. They're diversified but strategic. Whoever runs this understands long-term value. They must have standards." Helen directed this at Diana, who nodded. "Extremely high standards. Their due diligence is apparently intense. They evaluate everything: financials, operations, culture, leadership." Diana paused, and I watched her calculate whether to share the next detail. They even interview family members. This landed differently than she'd intended. Marcus frowned slightly. Jessica's eyes widened. Helen looked confused. "Family members? They want external perspectives. People who've observed how leadership operates under pressure." Diana met my eyes for the first time that evening. They asked if you'd be willing to participate, if the deal moves forward. The room held its breath for exactly 2 seconds. Then Marcus laughed, breaking the tension. That's thorough. What could Vicky possibly tell them about Morrison Global? The question wasn't hostile. It was simply obvious. I had no insight into Diana's business beyond what she shared at these dinners. I'd never visited her office during operational hours. I'd never met her clients or reviewed her strategies. I existed in her professional life the way I existed in her personal life, peripherally, occasionally, without particular significance. I can share family perspective. My voice was even, unremarkable. Character assessment. How someone handles stress. Leadership under pressure. Diana nodded, already moving past it. Exactly. They want a complete picture. It's actually impressive. Shows they care about cultural fit. Cultural fit. The phrase hung in the air like expensive perfume, present but impossible to grasp. Diana believed culture was something you designed and maintained through mission statements and core values. I knew culture was something that revealed itself in small moments, when people thought no one important was watching. The dinner continued. Dessert appeared, something involving caramel and hazelnuts that Diana had probably learned from a YouTube chef. Coffee followed. Conversation drifted to safer topics. Marcus's golf game, Jessica's apartment search, Helen's book club. I contributed appropriately timed nods and brief observations, playing the role I'd perfected over decades. Present but not prominent, engaged but not essential. Near the end of the evening, while Diana was in the kitchen and Marcus was helping Helen with her coat, Jessica approached me with an expression I couldn't immediately decode. Curiosity, maybe. Or pity. Aunt Vicky, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret not staying in private sector? You could have made so much more money. The question was innocent in the way that thoughtless questions often are. Jessica genuinely couldn't understand why someone would choose stability over wealth, purpose over profit. She'd been raised by a mother who measured success in revenue growth, and a father who traded other people's money for a living. The idea that someone might want something different wasn't hostile to her worldview. It was simply invisible. I made the choices that felt right at the time. But don't you wish you'd taken more risks? Built something bigger? I smiled, the expression careful and controlled. Sometimes the biggest risk is letting people underestimate you. Jessica laughed, assuming I'd made a joke. She patted my arm with the kind of casual affection people show toward pets or small children. You're funny, Aunt Vicky. I never noticed that. She walked away before I could respond, which was fine because I had nothing to add. The observation had been sincere. Underestimation was the most valuable asset I'd ever cultivated, more useful than any government contract or real estate holding. People couldn't defend against threats they didn't recognize. Diana drove me home that night because Marcus had drunk too much wine and Jessica had left early. We rode in silence for the first 10 minutes, her Tesla navigating Arlington streets with the smooth competence of expensive engineering. She broke the quiet just as we turned onto my street. Thank you for agreeing to the interview. If Vision Corp asks. I nodded, happy to help. Up. I know you probably think my life is very different from yours. It is different, but we're both successful, just in different ways. She said this with the tone of someone offering consolation, as if my success were something that needed generous interpretation to be recognized. You chose security. I chose ambition. Both are valid. She pulled into my driveway behind the Honda I'd bought used 6 years ago and never bothered replacing. The house looked exactly as it had when Richard died. Small, dated, functional. The mortgage was paid off. The property taxes were manageable. The neighbors were quiet. It was perfect for someone who wanted to be invisible. Thanks for the ride, Vicky. Diana's voice stopped me with my hand on the door handle. I'm proud of you. You know that, right? You did what worked for you. That takes courage. She meant it. That was the part that made it sting. Diana genuinely believed that settling for less required bravery, that accepting limitation was its own kind of strength. She'd wrapped my life in narrative that made sense to her, where I played the role of the sister who chose safety over ambition, comfort over risk, invisibility over impact. I nodded and got out of the car. She waited until I unlocked my front door before pulling away, the Tesla's headlights sweeping across my yard in a final gesture of protective concern. Inside, I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and opened my laptop. 3 emails waited from Catherine, each marked urgent, each requiring decisions about deals Diana would never know existed. I responded to all three in under 20 minutes, approving 2 acquisitions and declining 1. Then I opened the Morrison Global file I'd been building for the past 6 months. Diana didn't know Vision Corp had been tracking her company for over a year. She didn't know we'd analyzed every public filing, interviewed former employees, mapped her client relationships and vendor networks. She didn't know Paul Richardson had attended one of her industry panels and spent 90 minutes watching how she treated the hotel staff versus how she treated potential clients. She didn't know Catherine had reviewed 5 years of Morrison Global's HR complaints, all settled, all confidential, all revealing a pattern of behavior toward people Diana considered beneath her professional attention. The merger proposal wasn't an opportunity, it was an examination. And Diana was failing it without realizing the test had started. 30 years ago, when I was 25 and fresh out of Georgetown with degrees in economics and international relations, I'd received 2 job offers. Goldman Sachs wanted me for their analyst program. 80-hour weeks, crushing pressure, $250,000 compensation by year 3 if I survived. USAID wanted me for a procurement specialist role. Normal hours, meaningful work, GS7 salary that barely covered rent in a group house. I'd sat at my parents' kitchen table explaining both options. My father had interrupted before I finished. "Victoria, you're smart, but you're not competitive smart. Wall Street will eat you alive." He'd said it with such casual certainty, as if my limitations were obvious to everyone except me. Diana, 18 and about to start college, had absorbed this assessment without question. My mother had nodded, already composing the story she'd tell her friends about her older daughter's prudent choice. I'd taken the USAID job because arguing felt pointless, and because part of me wondered if they were right. Maybe I wasn't built for high-pressure environments. Maybe stability was the smart play for someone who'd rather avoid failure than chase exceptional success. It took 20 years to realize they'd been wrong. Not about my capabilities. Those had always been sufficient. They'd been wrong about what I wanted and what I was willing to sacrifice to get it. They'd assumed I wanted visibility, recognition, the kind of success that announced itself. They'd never considered I might want something else entirely. Power without performance, wealth without witness, impact without attribution. Richard had understood toward the end. We'd been married 15 years when his heart stopped in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon. 53 years old, no warning, no chronic condition. Just a catastrophic failure of an organ that had always worked until suddenly it didn't. The life insurance paid out $200,000. Diana had called 3 days after the funeral offering to help manage the money. She'd meant it kindly. She'd assumed I had no idea how to invest, no concept of market dynamics, no understanding that $200,000 could become something more if handled correctly. I'd thanked her and declined. Then I'd taken that money, added $50,000 from our savings, and registered Vision Corp Holdings as a Delaware LLC. The structure was complex. Multiple shell companies, nominee directors, layers of ownership that would require forensic accounting to untangle. Paul Richardson became CEO 6 months later, recruited from a consulting firm where he'd spent a decade making other people's strategies look brilliant. The first deal was government IT contract worth $12 million. I'd spent 8 years in USAID procurement. I knew which contracts were undervalued. I knew which vendors were overcharging. I knew exactly where inefficiency created opportunity. Vision Corp bid the contract at cost, won easily, then sold the rights to a private contractor for $18 million. $6 million profit in 6 months. I'd cried the night that deal closed. Not from joy, from recognition. I'd spent 20 years believing I wasn't capable of this kind of success because no one had ever expected it from me. Turned out capability wasn't the constraint. Permission was. And I'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to grant it. 10 years. 73 acquisitions, $3.1 billion in assets, $260 million in annual revenue. All built in the margins of a life everyone thought they understood. I'd continued working at USAID until I was 52, not because I needed the salary, but because I needed the access. Government procurement was a maze designed to confuse outsiders and reward insiders. I was the ultimate insider, and nobody suspected I was monetizing that knowledge through a company they didn't know I owned. Diana called me 4 days after the dinner to ask if I'd come to her office. She needed help with filing. Her assistant was out. She'd pay my hourly rate. I'd said yes because saying no would have required explanation, and because I wanted to see the office during business hours. Wanted to watch her move through her professional environment the way animals move through natural habitats. Unconscious, instinctive, revealing. The filing took 2 hours. Diana's organizational system was chaos masquerading as intention. I created order from it, which she noticed and appreciated, which led to her asking if I'd be available for the Vision Corp meetings the following week. They needed someone to handle logistics, setup, documents, the kind of administrative work that freed important people to focus on important things. She'd offered $35 an hour. I'd accepted. She'd looked relieved, as if she'd expected negotiation and was grateful to have avoided it. That was yesterday. Tomorrow, Paul and Catherine would arrive in New York for the first formal due diligence meeting. Diana would pitch her company to my board while I served coffee from the corner of the room. She'd explain Morrison Global's culture, values, and leadership philosophy to people who were really evaluating whether she demonstrated any of those qualities herself. I closed my laptop and looked around my small living room. The furniture was dated but comfortable. The carpet needed replacing. The walls could use fresh paint. Richard's photo sat on the mantel, frozen at 52, forever smiling at a joke I could no longer remember. He'd known about Vision Corp's first 3 deals before he died. He'd helped structure the initial Delaware filing. He'd promised not to tell Diana. Why not? I'd asked. She'd be proud. He'd considered this seriously, the way he considered everything, careful and thorough and ultimately accurate. Would she, or would she find a way to explain it that makes you smaller? I'd known the answer but hadn't wanted to say it aloud. Richard had said it for me. She needs you to be less, so she can be more. That's not cruelty. That's just how she sees the world. And changing how people see you is harder than becoming rich. He'd been right. Building a billion-dollar company had taken 12 years and countless hours of strategic thinking. But shifting Diana's perception would require something I wasn't sure existed. Evidence she couldn't dismiss. Context she couldn't reframe. Success she couldn't attribute to luck or circumstance or someone else's generosity. The Vision Corp deal would provide that evidence, not through revelation. I wasn't planning some dramatic announcement. Through demonstration. I'd let Diana present herself to my company. I'd let her explain her values while treating me like furniture. I'd document every moment of dissonance between what she claimed to believe and what her behavior revealed. And then I'd decline the merger. Professionally, politely, with exactly the kind of neutral language that concealed devastating assessment. Strategic fit insufficient, cultural alignment inadequate, portfolio priorities redirected. Diana would be furious. She'd blame me, probably, though she'd have no proof. She'd demand answers Paul couldn't give and Catherine wouldn't provide. She'd question everything about the process except the one variable that mattered: herself. My phone buzzed. Catherine again. Paul confirmed for tomorrow, 9 a.m., Morrison Global office. We've scheduled 4 hours. I typed back quickly. I'll be there at 8:30. Set up. The meeting would reveal everything. Not about Morrison Global's financials, those were fine. About Diana's character, her priorities, her automatic behaviors when she thought she was performing for equals. I'd spent 30 years being underestimated. Tomorrow I'd discover whether being underestimated by family felt different than being underestimated by strangers. The answer, I suspected, would hurt more than the question. I spent the evening preparing documents that Diana would assume I'd merely printed. Vision Corp's standard due diligence checklist, non-disclosure agreements, preliminary assessment frameworks. Each page looked bureaucratic and generic, the kind of corporate paperwork that filled binders in conference rooms worldwide. But embedded in the assessment framework were specific behavioral metrics that Catherine and I had developed over 8 years of acquisitions. How leadership treats unexpected obstacles, how they respond to questions they can't immediately answer, how they interact with people who can't advance their interests, whether they maintain consistency between stated values and observable actions. Most companies failed within the first hour. They claimed to value collaboration while talking over colleagues. They described commitment to diversity while making assumptions based on appearance. They preached work-life balance while sending emails at midnight with urgent flags. The gap between aspiration and execution told us everything we needed to know about whether a company could scale without fracturing. Diana would fail this evaluation. I'd known it before we'd formalized the acquisition interest, but I needed her to fail specifically, comprehensively, with documentation that even she couldn't reframe as misunderstanding or bad luck. I arrived at Morrison Global's office at 8:15 the next morning. The building was in Midtown, between a boutique hotel and a financial services firm that probably laundered money for people who'd learned that legitimate business was just sophisticated crime. The lobby featured marble that tried very hard to look expensive, and mostly succeeded. Security required ID and visitor logs. I signed in as administrative support, which was technically true. Diana's office was on 42. The elevator moved with the kind of smooth acceleration that cost extra and made visitors feel important. I was alone for the ride up, which gave me 30 seconds to settle into the role I'd be performing for the next 4 hours. Helpful, competent, invisible. The reception area was empty except for a young woman behind a curved desk who looked up from her computer with professional brightness. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for the Vision Corp meeting. Set up." She checked her screen, nodded, and gestured toward the conference room. "Ms. Morrison said you'd be early. Everything you need should be in there. Let me know if you need anything." I thanked her and entered the conference room, which was exactly as I'd expected. Glass walls, long table, 12 chairs, whiteboard on one end, video conferencing equipment that probably cost more than my car, windows overlooking the city, which was still waking up, traffic beginning to thicken on the streets below. I spent 20 minutes arranging materials, documents at each seat, water glasses filled, coffee station prepared. The room looked professional, neutral, ready for whatever performance would unfold here. At 8:40, Diana arrived, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of controlled readiness. "You're here." She scanned the room, noted the preparations, nodded with satisfaction. "Good, thank you." Her eyes moved past me to the window, already thinking ahead to the meeting, to Paul and Catherine, to the pitch she'd rehearsed. I was set up, background, completed task. She pulled out her phone and began typing, fingers moving with the rapid precision of someone managing multiple conversations simultaneously. At 8:55, Paul and Catherine arrived together. I'd worked with them for years, had hired them both, had sat through hundreds of hours of strategy sessions where we dissected companies the way surgeons dissected cadavers, clinical, thorough, unsentimental. But today, they greeted me as if we'd never met. Paul extended his hand to Diana first. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for hosting us." Diana shook it, her grip firm, her smile calibrated. "The pleasure is ours. We're excited about this opportunity." Catherine followed with her own introduction, equally professional, equally empty of history. They both glanced at me for exactly the length of time it took to register my presence, without requiring acknowledgement. Diana didn't introduce me. I was part of the room's infrastructure, as relevant as the coffee station or the video equipment. The next 2 hours would determine everything, not the merger. That decision had effectively been made weeks ago. But whether Diana would ever understand why. We took our seats, Diana at the head of the table, Paul and Catherine on one side, 2 Morrison Global executives I didn't recognize on the other side. I sat in the corner near the coffee station, laptop open, taking notes no one would read because I'd already decided what they'd say. Paul opened with standard pleasantries. Catherine followed with preliminary questions about financials. Diana responded with confidence, citing revenue growth, client retention, market positioning. She was good at this. I'd give her that. She understood how to present success in language that made investment seem inevitable. But then Catherine asked about culture. "Tell us how Morrison Global handles internal conflict." Diana leaned back slightly, the posture of someone comfortable with the question. "We're very direct. Honest feedback, high standards for everyone. We don't tolerate mediocrity." "How do you define mediocrity?" Diana paused, recognizing the trap without quite seeing its edges. People who don't meet objectives, who need excessive management, who can't keep pace. Keep pace with what? With growth, with evolution, with what clients need. She said this as if it were obvious, which to her it was. Some people plateau. That's natural, but we need team members who can scale with us. Paul nodded, making notes. And when someone plateaus, how do you handle that? Honestly, we have frank conversations. We help them transition to roles that better fit their capabilities. The language was careful, corporate, sanitized. What she meant was, we push them out, but she couldn't say that to potential acquirers who might value employee retention. So she wrapped dismissal in coaching language and hoped Paul wouldn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't. Catherine did. How do you handle employees with significant experience, but maybe not cutting-edge skills? This was aimed directly at someone. At me, specifically, though Diana wouldn't recognize it. Catherine was testing whether Diana could see value in experience, divorced from obvious productivity. Experience is important. Diana spoke carefully now, sensing scrutiny. But experience without adaptation is just repetition. We value people who grow. And those who don't grow? They find other opportunities. Diana met Catherine's eyes, her expression clear. We're not a charity. We're a business. The room absorbed this statement. Paul made another note. One of the Morrison executives shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the bluntness. I refilled my water glass. The sound of liquid against glass, the only noise for 3 seconds. Tell us about family involvement in the company. Catherine had moved to a new topic so smoothly that the previous question felt resolved rather than dodged. Do you hire family members? My daughter works here, Jessica. She earned her position. How did you ensure that? Same evaluation as any candidate. Same interview process. Same probationary period. Diana's voice carried defensive pride. I'm harder on her than on anyone else. Why? Because people assume nepotism. I have to prove it isn't. Catherine nodded, noting this. And other family members, extended family. Diana's eyes flicked toward me for half a second. I have a sister. She doesn't work here. She's not in the private sector. What does she do? Government work. Retired now, very different path. The words landed with a weight Diana didn't intend. Very different suggested incompatibility, divergence, paths that couldn't intersect. Paul looked at me for the first time with apparent interest, though we both knew he was performing. Is she here today? Diana blinked, genuinely surprised by the question. Yes, in the corner. She's helping with logistics. Paul stood and crossed the room, extending his hand. Paul Richardson, Vision Corp CEO. I shook it, maintaining the appropriate level of professional neutrality. Nice to meet you. Victoria Chen, Diana's sister. He nodded, taking in details. Government work, Diana mentioned. What area? USAID. Procurement mostly, 28 years. That's substantial experience. His tone carried respect that Diana's introduction had lacked. What brings you here today? Diana needed help with logistics. I had time. Paul smiled, the expression genuine enough to be convincing. Well, thank you for your time. We appreciate the support. He returned to his seat. Diana looked vaguely uncomfortable, as if the interaction had violated some unspoken protocol about who merited direct address. Catherine asked another question about client acquisition, and the conversation moved forward. I spent the next 40 minutes watching my sister perform. She was good. I couldn't deny that. Articulate, prepared, and strategic. She answered questions about market positioning and competitive advantage with the fluency of someone who'd built something real. But she also interrupted her own executives twice, corrected their phrasing 3 times, and checked her phone during one of Catherine's questions. Small things, easily excused individually. But patterns emerged when you watched carefully. Diana led by domination, not collaboration. She valued performance over people. She measured success in revenue rather than relationships. These weren't fatal flaws. They were just incompatibilities. With Vision Corp's culture, with my culture. At 11 o'clock, Diana suggested a break. The Morrison executives left to make calls. Paul and Catherine stepped into the hallway. Diana remained at the table, reviewing her notes, completely absorbed. I stood to refill coffee supplies. Diana glanced up. Can you order lunch? We'll probably go until 2. What would you like? Doesn't matter. Salads, probably. Ask them what they want. She returned to her notes. I was dismissed without being released. I stepped into the hallway where Paul and Catherine stood near the elevator, talking in low voices that stopped when they saw me. Diana asked me to order lunch. Do you have preferences? Catherine smiled, the expression professional. Whatever's easiest. We're not particular. Paul added, maybe check with Diana's team first. Make sure they have what they need. The phrasing was deliberate. Diana's team, not your sister's team. They were maintaining boundaries, keeping me in the role Diana had assigned. I nodded and returned to the conference room, where Diana was now on her phone, speaking in the rapid-fire cadence she used when managing multiple priorities. I need those projections by Wednesday. No, Wednesday. If we can't deliver on time, we're no better than the client we're advising. She hung up and looked at me expectantly. Lunch? Everyone said whatever's easiest. Then order whatever makes sense. Keep it under 30 per person. The budget consciousness struck me as performative. Morrison Global was pitching a $340 million deal. $30 per person for lunch was the kind of economizing that signaled virtue without requiring sacrifice. But I nodded and pulled out my phone, ordering from the Mediterranean place 3 blocks away that delivered quickly and charged exactly $28 per entree. The afternoon session covered operations. Catherine asked detailed questions about systems, processes, quality control. Diana's answers revealed a company running efficiently but not innovatively. They did what worked. They scaled what succeeded. They avoided risk unless the reward was overwhelming. Nothing wrong with that approach, but nothing exceptional either. At 1:30, lunch arrived. I distributed meals, collected the delivery bags, ensured everyone had utensils. Diana thanked me with a distracted nod. Paul and Catherine said nothing, already deep in discussion about integration timelines. I ate my salad in the corner, listening to my sister describe a future that would never happen. By 2:15, the meeting was winding down. Paul stood, shook hands, thanked Diana for her time and transparency. Catherine did the same, her expression professionally neutral. Diana walked them to the elevator, leaving me to clear the conference room, collecting papers, disposing of lunch containers, restoring the space to its original neutrality. When Diana returned, she looked exhausted but satisfied. That went well. Her voice carried relief. They asked good questions. They seemed impressed. I nodded, continuing to clean. She watched me for a moment, then spoke with something approaching genuine curiosity. What did you think? The question surprised me. Diana rarely asked for my opinion on professional matters. I chose words carefully. They're thorough, professional, they clearly have high standards. Do you think they'll move forward? I don't know, but they definitely collected the information they needed. Diana smiled, interpreting this as confirmation. Exactly. That's what due diligence looks like. She left the conference room, already pulling out her phone to make her next call. I finished cleaning, took a final look around to ensure nothing was forgotten, and left the building. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray, clouds moving in from the east. I walked 3 blocks to where I'd parked, climbed into my Honda, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed. Catherine, we need to debrief. Paul wants your read. I typed back quickly. Tomorrow, my office, 9 a.m. The drive back to Arlington took 40 minutes. Traffic was light. The radio played news about congressional dysfunction and weather systems. I thought about Diana's question. Do you think they'll move forward? The honest answer was no. We'd decline the merger within 2 weeks. But Diana wouldn't understand why, because understanding would require seeing herself through eyes that weren't clouded by affection or obligation or shared history. Catherine and Paul had documented behavior that Diana considered normal. We'd recorded treatment she thought was appropriate. We'd noted patterns she didn't realize she was creating. And when we declined, Diana would blame me. She'd suspect I'd said something, influenced something, sabotaged something. She wouldn't be entirely wrong, but she'd miss the larger point. I hadn't needed to say anything. I just needed to exist in her space while she treated me exactly as she always had. Underestimation was about to cost my sister $340 million. But what she'd lose in capital, she might gain in clarity. Might. People didn't usually learn from rejections. They learned from consequences. And consequences were just beginning. The private club occupied 3 floors of a building that had witnessed a century of deals made over scotch and cigars. Manhattan's financial district stretched outside the windows, steel and glass monuments to capital that moved through servers at light speed, while men in tailored suits pretended tradition still mattered. The club maintained leather chairs worn soft by decades of privileged comfort, oil paintings of men whose names meant nothing to anyone under 60, and a dress code that functioned less as standard than as gate. I arrived 90 minutes before the scheduled presentation. Security recognized Paul's name on my authorization, waved me through without requiring the usual membership verification. The conference room waited on the second floor, smaller than Morrison Global's space, but heavier with implication. Mahogany table, crystal water pitchers, windows that filtered morning light through curtains designed to make everyone look 10 years younger and significantly wealthier. Catherine had sent the setup instructions at 6 that morning. 12 presentation binders, coffee service for 8, recording equipment positioned to capture audio without being visible. The last requirement violated club policy, but Paul had negotiated an exception by citing corporate governance requirements that didn't actually exist. Vision Corp's due diligence process included documentation. Most companies never knew we collected. I arranged materials with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered more than grand gestures. Each binder positioned exactly parallel to the table edge. Each water glass filled to the same level. The coffee station assembled with the kind of careful attention that read as professional competence rather than obsessive control. Paul arrived at 7:45, carrying a leather portfolio that contained nothing he'd actually reference. He scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years evaluating spaces for tactical advantage. "Good morning, Victoria." We dispensed with pretense when alone. He'd been my CEO for 8 years. He knew exactly who signed his compensation agreements. "Everything ready?" "As specified." Diana's team arrives at 9. I gestured toward the recording equipment, invisible unless you knew where to look. "Audio will capture everything." Catherine's bringing the behavioral checklist. Paul moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of men who'd learned that stillness communicated authority. "Do you want to be here for this?" The question wasn't about logistics. He was asking whether watching Diana perform for my board while treating me as help was strategic or merely painful. I considered before answering. "I need to see how she operates when she thinks she's succeeding." Paul nodded without turning. "You're certain about the outcome?" "I've been certain for 3 weeks. This is documentation." He turned then, meeting my eyes with the direct assessment that made him effective at his job. "This isn't just business for you. It's exactly business. That's why it matters." Catherine arrived 10 minutes later, immediately crossing to where I stood near the coffee station. She carried a tablet that displayed the behavioral metrics we'd spent years refining. Patterns that revealed character when people stopped performing and started operating on instinct. "The Morrison executives don't know this is evaluation." Her voice stayed low despite the empty room. "Diana thinks this is showcase." "That's the point." I glanced at the checklist on her screen. "Same categories?" "Same categories." She scrolled through the framework. Treatment of support staff, consistency between stated values and observable behavior, response to questions they can't immediately answer, how they handle power differentials. The last category would destroy Diana. She didn't handle power differentials. She created them, maintained them, and used them to establish hierarchy that felt natural to her and oppressive to everyone else. 3 other Vision Corp executives arrived in the next 20 minutes. All understood their role. Evaluate Morrison Global with clinical detachment, while Diana believed they were impressed potential partners. We took positions around the table that created the illusion of collaborative discussion, while maintaining clear sightlines for observation. Diana arrived at 8:58 with Marcus, Jessica, and 2 senior executives whose names I'd forgotten because they'd never spoken directly to me. She wore navy this time, expensive but not ostentatious. The uniform of women who'd learned that power dressed conservatively until it didn't need to anymore. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging details with the speed of someone trained to assess environments. She registered Paul, Catherine, the other executives. Her gaze passed over me without pause, landing on the coffee station with brief calculation before returning to Paul. "Thank you for accommodating us here." Her handshake was firm, practiced, accompanied by the smile that had closed 7-figure consulting contracts. "We're excited to present Morrison Global's vision." Paul gestured to seats. "We're looking forward to hearing it." Diana positioned herself at the head of the table, a choice that would have been unremarkable except that this wasn't her space. Paul let it happen without comment. Catherine made a note on her tablet that no one else could see. "Before we begin," Diana's voice carried the particular confidence of someone about to deliver prepared remarks, "I want to thank everyone for their time." Vision Corp's reputation speaks to the kind of partnership we're seeking: strategic, values-driven, focused on sustainable growth rather than quick extraction. She'd researched our acquisition history. The phrasing echoed language from Vision Corp's limited public materials. I watched Paul's expression remain neutral, while Diana described my company's philosophy as if she'd discovered it rather than reading it from carefully curated marketing copy. The presentation lasted 90 minutes. Diana spoke about Morrison Global's client base, revenue trajectory, market positioning. Her slides were professional, her delivery polished. Jessica interjected twice with supporting data, both times waiting for Diana's nod before speaking. Marcus added contextual details about financial projections. I refilled water glasses at the 40-minute mark. Diana paused mid-sentence, waiting for me to finish before continuing. The interruption lasted 8 seconds. Catherine noted it. The presentation shifted to culture and values. This was the section I'd been waiting for, where Diana would describe Morrison Global's principles while demonstrating precisely how those principles functioned as aspiration rather than practice. We believe in meritocracy. Diana advanced to a slide featuring the word in bold typeface. Everyone at Morrison Global succeeds based on performance, not politics. We don't care about pedigree or connections. We care about results. How do you measure results? Catherine's question landed softly, more curiosity than challenge. Client satisfaction, revenue generation, project completion on time and under budget. Diana ticked items efficiently. We have clear KPIs for every role. And when someone consistently meets those KPIs but doesn't exceed them, Diana paused, the first genuine hesitation I'd seen. That depends on their role. Some positions have natural ceilings. Not everyone can be senior leadership. Why not? Because leadership requires specific qualities: vision, adaptability, the ability to operate under pressure without requiring excessive management. I was refilling coffee at the station behind Diana. She couldn't see my face, which was fortunate because the description she just offered perfectly characterized my actual role at Vision Corp, while excluding characteristics she'd assigned to me. I operated under extreme pressure. I required zero management. I had vision that had generated $3 billion in assets. But I existed in her perception as someone who needed excessive management, who lacked adaptability, who'd chosen predictable government work because I couldn't handle the pressure of private sector competition. Paul asked the next question. You mentioned vision. How does Morrison Global identify people with vision versus people who are simply competent? Diana leaned forward, animated now by a topic she'd clearly considered. Vision means seeing opportunities others miss. Being willing to take calculated risks, not accepting the status quo just because it's comfortable. Give us an example. When we expanded into European markets, most consultants said boutique firms couldn't compete internationally. We saw that as defeatist thinking. We took the risk and succeeded. Marcus added supporting detail about revenue from European operations. Jessica pulled up a slide showing growth trajectories. Diana smiled with the satisfaction of someone proving a point. And people who prefer stability over risk? Catherine's voice remained even. How do they fit into Morrison Global's culture? Diana's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. We respect different preferences. But honestly, this industry rewards boldness. People who prioritize safety usually plateau. The word landed exactly where I'd expected. Plateau, the same term she'd used to describe my career trajectory. Government work is safe harbor for people who couldn't navigate open waters. One of the Vision Corp executives spoke for the first time. What about experience? Does Morrison Global value longevity? Of course. Diana's response came quickly, reflexively. Experience provides context and institutional knowledge. But the executive had heard the implicit qualification. Diana shifted slightly, recalculating her answer. But experience alone isn't sufficient. The world changes. Strategies that worked 10 years ago don't work now. We need people who can evolve. And those who don't evolve, we help them transition, either to roles that better match their current capabilities or to opportunities outside Morrison Global. The phrasing was identical to language she'd used yesterday. Transition, capabilities is opportunities outside. Corporate euphemism for managed departure dressed in developmental language. I collected empty cups from the table, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that invisibility required active maintenance. Diana didn't pause her presentation. Jessica glanced at me with the vague awareness people show toward furniture being rearranged. Marcus checked his phone. Paul signaled for a break at the 90-minute mark. Diana looked relieved, probably assuming the hard part was finished. In reality, the hard part was about to begin. The Morrison team stepped into the hallway. Diana pulled out her phone immediately, responding to messages that had accumulated during her performance. Jessica and Marcus discussed European client scheduling. The two executives, whose names I still didn't know, reviewed presentation materials. Paul, Catherine, and I remained in the conference room with the other Vision Corp executives. Catherine pulled up her tablet, displaying the behavioral checklist with preliminary assessments. Consistency between stated values and observable actions. Low. Catherine spoke matter-of-factly. Claims to value meritocracy while describing natural ceilings for certain employees. Claims to respect experience while categorizing it as insufficient without evolution. Claims direct communication while using euphemistic language for termination. Treatment of support staff. Minimal awareness. Paul gestured toward where I'd been standing. Victoria refilled water glasses twice and collected cups once. Diana paused for the water, didn't acknowledge the cup removal, never made eye contact. One of the executives added his observation. The daughter waited for permission before speaking. The husband deferred automatically. Morrison Global's meritocracy appears to have predetermined hierarchy. Catherine made notes rapidly. This aligns with HR complaint patterns we reviewed. Confidential settlements with 3 former employees citing hostile environment towards staff, Diana considered non-essential. Paul looked at me directly. Victoria, do you want to continue? The question acknowledged what everyone in the room understood. This evaluation had personal dimensions that complicated professional assessment. I could end it now, decline the merger based on evidence already collected, walk away before Diana said anything else that revealed the gap between who she claimed to be and who she actually was. But walking away would teach Diana nothing. She'd rationalize the rejection as Vision Corp's loss, Morrison Global's escape from partnership with a company that didn't share her vision. She'd never examine her own behavior, because she'd never see evidence of what that behavior looked like from the outside. Continue. My voice was steady. I want documentation of the full presentation. Paul nodded. Catherine saved her notes. The Vision Corp executives returned to their seats. We waited. Diana came back energized, probably from whatever phone call had boosted her confidence. The afternoon session covered integration planning, which required discussing sensitive financial information about Vision Corp's existing portfolio. Catherine broached the topic carefully. We need to review confidential acquisition data. Protocol requires limiting attendance to principals and senior executives. And Diana nodded understanding. Of course. She turned to the 2 Morrison executives. Would you mind stepping out? We'll brief you afterward. The executives gathered materials and left without question. Diana turned back to the table, ready to continue, apparently forgetting I was still present. Paul's eyes flicked toward me briefly, then returned to Diana. This information is highly confidential. We'll need everyone not essential to merger discussions to wait outside. Diana blinked, processing the implication, then looked at where I stood near the coffee station, as if noticing me for the first time in an hour. Oh, right, Vicky, do you mind? Her tone wasn't unkind. It was simply obvious. I wasn't essential. I was help hired for logistics. Of course, I'd wait in the hallway while the important people discussed important things. Of course. I gathered my tablet and phone, maintaining the appropriate level of professional neutrality. There's a waiting area downstairs. Marcus added this helpfully, as if I might not know where to go. Comfortable chairs, good coffee. I left the conference room, pulling the door closed behind me with the soft click of expensive hardware. The hallway was empty except for the 2 Morrison executives standing by a window, reviewing spreadsheets on a laptop. They nodded politely when I passed. The waiting area was exactly as Marcus had described. Comfortable chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Coffee that had been ground minutes before brewing. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's financial district, where wealth accumulated in buildings that blocked sunlight from the streets below. I sat in a chair positioned to see the elevator, pulled out my phone, and texted Catherine through our secure app. The recording still active? Her response came within seconds. Yes, audio quality excellent. Currently discussing Vision Corp portfolio structure and acquisition criteria. which means they're discussing my strategy, my decisions, my criteria for evaluating whether companies meet standards that Diana was currently failing to demonstrate. I was being excluded from a meeting about my own company. While my sister explained to my employees why Morrison Global deserved acquisition, I'd already decided not to approve. The irony would have been funny if it didn't crystallize 3 decades of similar exclusions. Dinners where conversations continued after I left the room. Career advice offered to Diana while I received polite questions about my pension. Family decisions made without consulting me because everyone already knew my opinion wouldn't alter outcomes. My phone buzzed again. Catherine. Diana is asking about Vision Corp's ownership structure. Paul is deflecting appropriately, but she's persistent about wanting to know who makes final acquisition decisions. Tell him to say board consensus with veto authority held by majority stakeholder. Catherine. She's asking if there's any way to meet the majority stakeholder. Tell him it's not standard protocol, but we'll consider requests after preliminary approval. I watched people move through the lobby below. Men in suits that cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. Women in heels that looked like instruments of torture and symbols of power simultaneously. Everyone performing competence in spaces designed to make that performance feel natural. 40 minutes passed. I drank coffee that tasted like someone had studied the concept of coffee and recreated it using only premium ingredients and no soul. The Morrison executives left at some point, probably told the meeting was running long and they could wait back at their office. At 1:30, my phone buzzed. Paul. We're finished. Diana wants to take the team to lunch. You can head home or meet us at the office tomorrow for the follow-up session. I typed back. I'll head home. Send me the recording. Paul. Already uploaded to secure server. Catherine flagged 17 behavioral patterns that warrant review. 17 was more than I'd expected. I'd been counting 8, maybe 10. 17 suggested patterns so consistent that Catherine had documented them using our most stringent evaluation criteria. I took the elevator down, emerged into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the club's carefully modulated lighting. My car was in a garage 3 blocks away. I walked slowly, watching tourists photograph buildings they'd seen in movies, street vendors selling nuts and pretzels, a woman sitting against a building with a cardboard sign explaining that she'd lost her job and needed help. I pulled out my wallet and handed her a 20. She looked up with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. Bless you. I nodded and kept walking. Diana would have walked past without seeing her. Marcus would have seen her and felt vaguely uncomfortable. Jessica would have taken a photo for Instagram with a caption about income inequality. None of them would have understood that the woman wasn't asking for charity. She was asking to be seen. The drive back to Arlington took longer than usual. Traffic snarled around an accident on the GW Parkway. I sat in unmoving cars, listening to news about inflation and congressional investigations, thinking about how Diana had described Morrison Global's values while demonstrating precisely the opposite in ways she didn't recognize. At home, I opened my laptop and accessed the secure server where Catherine had uploaded the meeting recording. Audio only, as specified. Voices that had filled the conference room now compressed into digital files, organized by timestamp and speaker. I listened to the full 3 hours, making notes in the margin of the behavioral assessment Catherine had already begun. Diana's interruptions of her own executives, the way she corrected Jessica's pronunciation of a client's name during the presentation, how she checked her phone during Paul's question about integration timelines. Small things, individually excusable, collectively revealing. At 17 minutes into the second hour, Diana said something I'd missed during the actual meeting because I'd been refilling water glasses. Paul had asked about Morrison Global's employee retention rates. We maintain industry-standard retention in essential roles. Diana's voice came through clearly in the recording. Leadership, senior consultants, client-facing positions. We see more turnover in administrative and support functions, but that's expected. Those roles are more fungible, interchangeable, replaceable without loss of value. She'd use that word to describe human beings whose work enabled her business to function, but whose contributions she measured as equivalent to office supplies ordered in bulk. I stopped the recording and sat motionless for 3 minutes, watching my screensaver cycle through images of national parks I'd visited with Richard. Arches, Yellowstone, Olympic. He'd loved those trips because they represented the opposite of work. spaces where human achievement meant nothing, and nature maintained its own timeline regardless of our urgency. He'd understand why this hurt more than professional rejection. Diana wasn't deliberately cruel. She was thoughtlessly dismissive, which was somehow worse. Cruelty required seeing someone clearly enough to hurt them intentionally. Dismissal meant never seeing them clearly at all. My phone rang. Diana. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message. Vicky, hi. Thank you for helping today. The meeting went extremely well. Paul said they need to do some final assessments, but he seemed positive. Listen, can we talk? I'd like to get your impression of how things went. Call me back when you have a chance. Her voice carried satisfaction and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Excitement, maybe. Or relief that the hard part was finished and approval seemed imminent. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened a new document and began drafting the recommendation that would go to Vision Corp's board. Formal, professional, stripped of personal history and reduced to the kind of neutral language that concealed devastating assessment behind corporate euphemism. Acquisition assessment. Morrison Global Consultancy recommendation. Decline primary rationale. Cultural incompatibility with Vision Corp's operational values regarding personnel development, leadership consistency, and organizational sustainability. Catherine called at 4. We need to schedule the formal board review, day after tomorrow? Confirmed. My office. Full board attendance. Paul wants to know if you're going to disclose. Disclose what? Your relationship to Diana, to the board. They already know. I hired them to evaluate acquisitions based on criteria I established. Whether the target company is run by my sister doesn't change those criteria. Catherine was quiet for 3 seconds. It changes the optics, only if we allow it to. This is business assessment. Diana was evaluated using the same framework we apply to every potential acquisition. She failed based on documented behavioral patterns. The board needs to know I have personal knowledge of those patterns, but that knowledge represents additional data rather than bias. And if Diana finds out afterward, she will find out, eventually. I leaned back in my chair, staring at my ceiling that needed new texture. When she does, she'll claim this was personal. She'll be partially right. But business and personal aren't separate categories. They're different lenses for viewing the same reality. Catherine made a sound that might have been agreement or concern. I'll send the board packet tonight. Review by 9 tomorrow, formal vote by noon the following day. After we hung up, I sat in my living room as afternoon faded into early evening. The house felt too quiet. It had felt too quiet since Richard died. But today, the silence carried additional weight. He would have known what to say about Diana. He'd always been better at translating my clinical observations into emotional truth. I made tea. I didn't drink and stared at Richard's photo on the mantel. 52 forever. Smiling at something I'd said, probably something sarcastic about the restaurant we'd visited that night in Seattle. Our last vacation before his heart stopped maintaining rhythm that had always seemed reliable until it wasn't. What would he say about declining the merger? About documenting Diana's failures with the thoroughness I'd apply to any acquisition target? He'd probably say what he'd said 6 months before he died, when I'd told him about Vision Corp's 5th acquisition and my decision to remain anonymous as primary owner. You're building something remarkable. His words had been quiet, factual. But you're building it in isolation. One day you'll want people to know. And when that day comes, you need to be ready for how they'll reinterpret your past to make sense of your present. I hadn't understood then. I thought he meant Diana would be proud once she knew, that she'd admire what I'd built. That revelation would shift her perception from dismissive to respectful. But that wasn't what he'd meant. He'd meant Diana would find ways to explain my success that preserved her worldview. Lucky breaks, right place at the right time, insider information from government work that wasn't quite ethical but wasn't quite illegal. Anything except acknowledging that her older sister had possessed capability all along that Diana had simply never recognized. My phone rang again, my mother this time. I answered because avoiding her would require explanation later. Victoria. Her voice carried the warmth that had always come more easily for Diana than for me. I heard Diana's meeting went wonderfully. News traveled fast through family channels that functioned more like information highways than confidential routes. It went well, non-committal, truthful, not revealing. Diana seems very excited. She thinks this partnership could transform her business. She's worked hard. She deserves success. My mother heard something in my tone. Is everything all right? Fine, just tired. It was a long day. Helen paused, and I could hear calculation happening in that silence. You know, Diana mentioned you were there, helping with logistics. That was kind of you. She needed someone. I was available. Still, Helen's voice shifted into the register she used when delivering observations meant to be insights. It must be strange for you, watching Diana achieve so much, building this impressive company, making these important deals. There it was, the assumption so automatic that my mother didn't realize she'd made it. Diana achieving while I watched. Diana building while I assisted. Diana's importance creating contrast that made my adequacy feel like limitation. I'm proud of her. True statement. Incomplete truth. Of course you are. You're a good sister. Always have been. Even when you were younger and Diana was getting all the attention for her academics, you never seemed jealous. I wasn't jealous. Also true. Jealousy required wanting what someone else had. I'd wanted something entirely different. Recognition that achievement took multiple forms and success wasn't singular. Your father used to say you were the steady one. Diana was the star, but you were the foundation. He meant it as a compliment. I remembered that phrasing. Foundation. Solid. Necessary. Invisible unless the structure collapsed. My father had offered it with genuine affection, believing he was valuing my contribution rather than minimizing it. I should go, Mom. I have work tomorrow. Of course, get some rest. And Victoria? I'm glad you're helping Diana with this. Family supporting family, that's what matters. She hung up before I could respond, which was fortunate because I had no response that wouldn't reveal more than this conversation could contain. I spent the evening reviewing Catherine's full behavioral assessment. She documented patterns with the precision we developed over 8 years of evaluating companies that claimed values they didn't demonstrate. Diana had hit every warning indicator we'd identified as predictive of cultural dysfunction. Inconsistency between stated principles and observable actions, documented in 14 separate instances. Hierarchical communication patterns that contradicted claimed meritocracy, present in every interaction with subordinates. Treatment of personnel based on perceived value rather than inherent dignity, evident throughout presentation and break periods. The assessment concluded with Catherine's professional recommendation, stripped of emotion but clear in implication. Morrison Global Consultancy demonstrates cultural characteristics incompatible with Vision Corp Holdings' operational philosophy. Acquisition not recommended regardless of financial performance. I forwarded the assessment to all board members with a note scheduling the formal review for the following afternoon. Then I closed my laptop and sat in darkness that felt appropriate for making decisions that would permanently alter my relationship with my sister. Diana called again at 9. This time I answered. Vicky, finally. Her relief was audible. I was starting to worry. Sorry, I've been busy. Listen, I wanted to get your read on today. You were there for the whole presentation. How did it seem to you? Professional, you presented well. But do you think they'll move forward? I know you don't have inside knowledge, but you observed them. What was your gut reaction? This was the moment. I could offer reassurance that would feel kind in the short term and devastating in the long term. Or I could offer truth she wasn't ready to hear and wouldn't believe coming from me. I think they collected a lot of information. Their decision will depend on what that information revealed. That's cryptic. Diana laughed nervously. You're starting to sound like Paul. He's careful with his words. That's appropriate for this stage. Okay, but between us, sister to sister, did anything concern you? Anything that seemed like a red flag? I could have listed 17 documented behavioral patterns. I could have played back the recording where she called human beings fungible. I could have explained that she treated me exactly the way she treated everyone she considered non-essential, and that treatment had been captured on audio that would be reviewed by a board making decisions about her company's future. Instead, I said, Diana, they're evaluating cultural fit, not just financial performance. Culture reveals itself in how you treat people when you think no one's evaluating you. She was quiet for 5 seconds. What does that mean? It means the assessment isn't finished. They're still collecting data. That doesn't answer my question. Her voice carried frustration now, the tone of someone who'd asked for reassurance and received ambiguity instead. Because I don't have an answer yet. The decision hasn't been made, but you'll tell me. Her statement carried assumption. If you hear anything, if there are concerns, you'll let me know? Diana, I'm not an intermediary. I'm not part of Vision Corp's decision process. But you were there, you observed, you must have some insight. My insight is that you should focus on what you can control and let Vision Corp's process unfold without trying to influence it. That sounds like you think there's a problem. Frustration was shifting toward suspicion. I could hear the change in her voice, the way certainty was giving way to doubt. I think you should trust the process. If there are concerns, Paul will raise them through appropriate channels. Diana exhaled sharply. Fine, if you can't tell me anything useful, I'll stop bothering you. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set my phone down and stared at it for 30 seconds, wondering if that was the last civil conversation my sister and I would have before everything changed. The board meeting convened at 2 the following afternoon in Vision Corp's actual headquarters, a deliberately modest building in Arlington that housed the infrastructure Diana didn't know existed. Conference room on the 3rd floor. 7 board members, including me, Paul and Catherine presenting their assessment. No audience, no performance, just evaluation based on documentation. Paul opened with financial summary that confirmed what we already knew. Morrison Global was profitable, growing, well-positioned in its market sector. Catherine followed with operational assessment that identified no significant concerns about systems, processes, or client relationships. Then they presented the cultural evaluation. Catherine displayed the behavioral metrics on the screen. 17 documented patterns across 2 days of observation. Audio clips selected for clarity rather than dramatic impact. Diana's own words describing fungible employees and natural ceilings and people who plateau. Marcus and Jessica's deference not to expertise but to authority. The treatment of me as furniture that occasionally needed moving. The board reviewed materials in silence that stretched across 15 minutes. One executive asked questions about the audio authentication. Another wanted clarification on specific behavioral patterns. A third requested comparison data from previous acquisitions that Vision Corp had approved versus those we'd declined. Catherine provided everything requested. The comparison data was particularly damning. Companies Vision Corp had acquired showed consistent respect for all personnel regardless of hierarchy. Leaders in those organizations knew support staff by name, thanked them directly, and treated logistical help as collaboration rather than service. Diana had done none of those things, not because she was deliberately cruel, but because she genuinely didn't notice people she'd categorized as non-essential. And failure to notice was worse than intentional disrespect, because it suggested behavior so automatic she'd never questioned whether it needed examination. After the presentation, Paul asked the question the board needed to address. Given Morrison Global's financial performance and strategic fit with our portfolio, do cultural concerns warrant declining this acquisition? 3 board members responded immediately. Yes. 2 more added agreement after brief consideration. The remaining executive, a former tech CEO who joined our board 2 years earlier, asked me directly, Victoria, you're the majority stakeholder. You have final authority, but you're also personally connected to the target. How do you separate those factors? I'd prepared for this question. I don't separate them. My personal knowledge of Diana Morrison provides additional data, not bias. I've observed her behavior for 48 years. The patterns Paul and Catherine documented aren't anomalies. They're consistent with how she's operated throughout her career. The executive nodded slowly. You're recommending decline? I'm recommending we maintain the standards we established when Vision Corp was founded. We don't acquire companies whose leadership treats people as disposable, regardless of financial performance, regardless of market position, and regardless of whether the CEO is my sister. Paul made notes. Catherine updated her tablet. The board members exchanged glances that communicated consensus without requiring explicit vote. The formal motion was made and seconded within 2 minutes. Vision Corp Holdings would decline the proposed acquisition of Morrison Global Consultancy. Recommendation would be delivered through standard channels. No specific cultural concerns would be detailed in the rejection letter. The meeting adjourned. Board members left efficiently, already moving to their next obligations. Catherine approached me as I gathered materials. You okay? I'm fine. The delivery goes out tomorrow. Paul will handle it personally. Diana will receive formal rejection by the end of business. I nodded. She'll want to know why. And we'll tell her what we tell everyone. Strategic portfolio priorities have shifted. Nothing more. She'll suspect I influenced it. Catherine studied my face with the direct assessment I valued in her work. Did you? I provided data. The board made the decision. That's not really an answer. I met her eyes. Yes, I influenced it. By building a company with standards that Morrison Global doesn't meet. By establishing criteria that prioritize culture over capital. By being in the room when Diana demonstrated exactly why those standards matter. Catherine smiled slightly. That's an answer. She left. I remained in the conference room, staring at the screen that still displayed Diana's financial projections. Impressive numbers, strong growth. Everything that would have made this acquisition seem obvious if we'd evaluated only what could be measured in spreadsheets. But Vision Corp had never been only about spreadsheets. We'd built something that survived and thrived because we understood that culture was an abstract aspiration. Culture was documented behavior when no one you respected was watching. And Diana's behavior, documented carefully over 2 days, had revealed everything the board needed to see. Tomorrow she'd receive rejection. Within a week, she'd probably guess I'd been involved. Within a month, she might discover I wasn't just involved, but responsible. And then we'd have a conversation neither of us was prepared for, where I'd finally stop being invisible, and she'd finally see exactly what she'd missed for 48 years. But tonight, in an empty conference room in a building my sister didn't know I owned, I sat alone with the documentation of her failure and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction but wasn't quite regret either. It was recognition. The kind that came from finally having evidence that couldn't be dismissed or reframed or explained away. Diana had been evaluated using objective criteria. She'd failed on her own merits. And no amount of family history or shared DNA would change the conclusions we'd reached. I powered down the display, turned off the lights, and locked the conference room behind me. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight brought clarity. And clarity, I'd learned, was worth almost any price. The letter arrived at Morrison Global's office at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier who required signature confirmation. Diana signed without reading the return address, probably expecting contract revisions or client documents that needed immediate attention. She called me 90 minutes later, and I knew from the first syllable that she'd opened it. They declined. Her voice carried disbelief that hadn't yet transformed into anger. That transition would come, but for now, she was stuck in the cognitive dissonance of having certainty shattered by reality that refused to match expectation. I'm sorry. Did you know? The question came faster than I'd anticipated. Did they tell you this was coming? No one told me anything. Technically accurate. No one had told me. I'd made the decision myself. The letter doesn't say why, just strategic portfolio priorities. What does that even mean? It means they decided Morrison Global isn't the right fit for their acquisition strategy. Diana made a sound between laugh and exhale. That's corporate speak for nothing. They spent 2 days evaluating us. Paul seemed positive. Catherine asked detailed questions. Everything pointed toward approval. Sometimes evaluation reveals information that changes perspective. Whose perspective? Diana's voice sharpened. Did something happen? Did someone say something? I was there for the presentation. You were there. Nothing happened that you didn't see. But something must have happened. Companies don't walk away from deals like this without reason. $340 million, strategic fit, growth potential. We checked every box. Apparently not every box. The words came out colder than I'd intended. Diana heard it. What is that supposed to mean? It means Vision Corp evaluates more than financials. They look at culture, leadership, how companies treat people at every level. We have good culture. Diana's defensiveness was automatic. Low turnover in key positions, strong client relationships, clear values. Stated values aren't the same as demonstrated values. Now you sound like a consultant. Diana's frustration was building toward something larger. I don't need corporate philosophy. I need to understand what went wrong. And maybe nothing went wrong. Maybe they just saw something that didn't align with what they're looking for. Like what? Specifically. What could they have possibly seen in 2 days that made them walk away from an excellent acquisition target? I could have told her. 17 documented behavioral patterns, audio recordings of her describing employees as fungible, the way she dismissed me from meetings about my own company. But telling her wouldn't change anything. She'd reject the assessment or rationalize the behavior or find ways to blame external factors for internal patterns. You'd have to ask them. I don't have access to their decision process. But you were there. Diana's voice carried an edge I recognized from childhood arguments about whose turn it was to set the table or who'd left the garage door open. You observed everything. You must have some insight. My insight is that Vision Corp takes cultural evaluations seriously, more seriously than most companies expect. And you think our culture is bad? Is that what you're saying? I'm saying every company thinks its culture is better than observation suggests. Diana was quiet for 10 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, cooler, more calculated. Did you say something to them about me, about Morrison Global? No, because if you said something that influenced their decision, that would be sabotage. Family sabotaging family. I didn't sabotage anything. Your company was evaluated using the same criteria Vision Corp applies to every acquisition target. The board reviewed the assessment and declined. That's how due diligence works. How do you know what criteria they use? How do you know what the board reviewed? The question hung between us, and I realized I'd revealed more than someone playing the role of administrative help should know. Diana was smart enough to notice the slip, but not yet suspicious enough to pursue it. I'm guessing based on standard practice. Paul and Catherine seemed thorough. That's all. Right. Diana's skepticism was audible. Well, thanks for your help this week. I'll let you know if we need anything else. She hung up before I could respond. I set my phone down and stared at it, waiting for the next call that would come when anger finished processing disappointment and found a target for blame. The call came the next morning at 7. Diana's voice bypassed greeting and went straight to accusation. I need to see you today. I'm busy today. Not true, but necessary. Cancel. This is important. I'm coming to your house. Be there at 10. She hung up before I could refuse. I spent the next 3 hours preparing for confrontation that felt inevitable from the moment the board had voted. Made coffee I probably wouldn't drink. Cleaned a kitchen that wasn't particularly dirty. Organized papers that were already organized. At 9:55, Diana's Mercedes pulled into my driveway with the aggressive certainty of someone who decided conflict was unavoidable and immediate. She didn't knock. Walked through my unlocked front door with the presumption of family who'd never been told they needed permission. Found me in the kitchen and stopped 3 feet away with crossed arms and expression that mixed anger with something closer to betrayal. What did you tell them? Good morning to you too. Don't. Diana's voice cut sharp. I talked to Paul yesterday, asked for specific feedback about why they declined. He wouldn't give details. Said the decision was based on comprehensive evaluation. When I pushed, he said I should discuss concerns with family members who might have insight. That sounds like he was being diplomatic. That sounds like he was telling me you said something. Or it sounds like he thinks someone in your family observed something worth discussing. Diana moved closer, invading space in the way people do when they want to intimidate through proximity. You were there. In the meetings, taking notes, serving coffee. You heard everything we said, saw how we presented. What did you tell them that made them walk away? I told them nothing. I don't believe you. That's your choice. Diana's hands clenched. You've always been jealous. Since we were kids. Dad saw it, Mom saw it. You couldn't handle that I was successful and you weren't, so you found a way to hurt me. The accusation was so far from truth that it almost made me laugh. Diana had constructed narrative where my entire existence revolved around her achievements, where my choices were reactions to her success rather than independent decisions based on different priorities. If that's what you need to believe, what I need is the truth. Diana's voice rose. What did you say to Vision Corp? What lies did you tell them about Morrison Global? I didn't lie. I observed. There's a difference. Observed what? Diana's frustration was building towards something that looked like genuine confusion beneath the anger. We ran professional meetings. We presented strong financials. We demonstrated clear strategy. What could you possibly have observed that justified their decision? How you treat people you don't consider important. The words landed with weight I hadn't fully intended. Diana blinked, processing. What does that mean? It means you called employees fungible. You described natural ceilings for certain people. You checked your phone while Catherine was asking questions. You dismissed me from meetings without realizing how that looked. I asked you to step out during confidential discussions. That's standard protocol. It wasn't just the asking, it was the assumption that I was help rather than person. You didn't introduce me to anyone. You didn't thank me for setup. You treated me exactly the way you treat everyone you've categorized as non-essential. Diana stared at me like I'd started speaking a language she didn't recognize. You're upset because I didn't thank you enough? That's why you sabotaged my deal? I didn't sabotage anything. But yes, how you treat people reveals character. And character matters to companies that evaluate culture seriously. This is insane. Diana's hands gestured sharply. You're telling me Vision Corp walked away from $340 million because I didn't say thank you enough? I'm telling you they walked away because the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior was too large to ignore. You don't know what they think. You're guessing. You're making assumptions based on nothing. I'm making observations based on 2 days of watching you operate. Diana turned away, paced 3 steps, turned back. You cost me this deal, whether you said something directly or just poisoned the atmosphere with your attitude. You cost me the biggest opportunity of my career. If that's true, you should examine why your behavior gave me material to poison anything with. Diana's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means maybe the problem isn't what I observed. Maybe it's what you did that was observable. We stared at each other across my kitchen, and I watched her calculating whether to escalate or retreat. She chose retreat, but the kind that promised return with better weapons. I'm going to find out what happened. Diana's voice had dropped to something colder than anger. I'm going to talk to people, research Vision Corp, figure out exactly why they declined. And if I find out you had anything to do with it, we're done. Family or not, we're done. She left without closing the door. I listened to her car reverse aggressively out of my driveway, tires squealing slightly on pavement that didn't deserve that kind of treatment. The confrontation had gone exactly as I'd expected, which didn't make it feel any better. Diana would investigate now. She'd look for evidence of my influence. And eventually she'd find more than influence. She'd find ownership. Marcus called me 3 days later, which was faster than I'd anticipated, but slower than Diana's fury suggested. His voice carried professional courtesy that barely masked interrogation. Victoria, do you have a few minutes? For you, of course. I wanted to ask about the Vision Corp situation. Diana's taken it hard. She's convinced something went wrong that wasn't about Morrison Global's merits. Acquisitions fall through for many reasons. Portfolio strategy changes. Board priorities shift. It's not always about the target company. Right. Marcus paused, and I heard paper rustling. I've been reviewing Vision Corp's public information, their acquisition history, portfolio composition. It's surprisingly difficult to find details about ownership structure. Private companies often maintain confidentiality about ownership. True. But this level of opacity is unusual even for private equity. Delaware Shell Company. No listed principals beyond CEO and CFO. No interviews, no public statements beyond minimal press releases. Some people value privacy. Some people have things to hide. The statement hung between us, heavy with implication that Marcus probably didn't intend, but I heard clearly. I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. Marcus's tone remained carefully neutral. I'm just noting that Vision Corp has unusual ownership structure. And I'm wondering if anyone you know has insight into who actually controls the company. Why would I know that? You were present during due diligence. You might have heard things, observed things. I observed a professional evaluation process, nothing more. Marcus made a non-committal sound. Diana thinks you influenced their decision. I told her that's unlikely, but she's adamant something isn't adding up. Diana's looking for external explanations for internal problems. What internal problems? The kind that become visible when someone evaluates behavior instead of just performance. Marcus was quiet for 5 seconds. You did notice something. I noticed what anyone would notice if they were paying attention. And you shared those observations with Vision Corp? I shared nothing. They observed for themselves. But you were there, as family. That must have provided context. Context they would have gathered regardless of my presence. Marcus exhaled slowly. Look, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just trying to understand what happened. Diana's hurt. She's angry. She needs closure. Then she should accept that not every deal succeeds and move forward. Is that what you'd do? If you'd spent months on a major acquisition and it fell through with no clear explanation, I'd examine whether the explanation was unclear or just uncomfortable. Marcus didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had shifted slightly. Diana mentioned you made some interesting comments about Vision Corp's evaluation criteria, how people treat non-essential personnel. That's very specific insight for someone who was just helping with logistics. It's observation anyone could make, but you made it. And you articulated it in ways that suggest familiarity with due diligence frameworks. I pay attention. That doesn't mean I have insider knowledge. Marcus made another non-committal sound. All right. Well, if you think of anything that might help Diana understand what happened, let me know. He hung up before I could respond. I set my phone down and stared at it, recognizing that Marcus had just signaled he was investigating seriously. Diana's hurt had triggered his protective instincts, and those instincts were now focused on finding explanations that would absolve her of responsibility. The PI report arrived at Diana's office 2 weeks later. Marcus had hired someone expensive, someone thorough, someone who knew how to trace corporate structures through Delaware registrations and nominee directors and shell companies designed to obscure ownership. The investigation had cost $15,000 and taken 12 days of intensive research. Diana called me at 8 on a Tuesday morning. Her voice shook with something beyond anger. We need to talk. Family meeting. Tonight, Mom's apartment, 7 o'clock. Be there. Diana, be there. She hung up. I sat in my kitchen, holding a phone that felt heavier than its actual weight, knowing that whatever Marcus had discovered would be presented as evidence tonight. The performance I'd maintained for 12 years was ending, not through my choice, but through Diana's need to understand what had happened in ways that made sense to her worldview. I arrived at Helen's apartment at 6:55. The building was senior living with good lighting and accessible design, paid for by a trust fund Diana didn't know I'd established when our mother turned 75. The apartment itself was comfortable but modest, furnished with pieces from the house where we'd grown up mixed with newer items that made concessions to aging without advertising them. Helen opened the door with expression that combined concern and confusion. Victoria, what's this about? Diana didn't tell you? She said family meeting, important discussion. She seemed upset. I stepped inside. Diana and Marcus sat in the living room, papers spread across the coffee table. Jessica wasn't present, which meant whatever confrontation Diana had planned was intended for adults only. My mother took her seat in the chair by the window, leaving me the sofa opposite Diana. Diana wasted no time. She slid a folder across the coffee table toward me. Explain this. I opened the folder, though I already knew what it contained. PI report, corporate structure diagrams, Delaware filing documents, all the layers I'd carefully constructed to maintain anonymity, now exposed through patient investigation that had cost more than most people earned in a month. You hired an investigator. I kept my voice neutral. Marcus did. Diana leaned forward. Because we knew something didn't add up. Vision Corp's rejection. Your comments about their evaluation process. The way Paul told me to discuss concerns with family. It didn't make sense until we saw this. She pointed to a line highlighted in yellow. Vision Corp Holdings, LLC. Majority owner, Victoria Chen. DOB and social security number matched mine exactly. Helen made a small sound of confusion. I don't understand. What is this? This. Diana's voice carried emotion that hadn't yet organized itself into coherent response. This is proof that Vicky owns Vision Corp, the company that evaluated Morrison Global, the company that declined our merger. My sister owns it. The apartment held silence that stretched across 10 seconds. Helen looked from the document to me, with expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been hurt. Victoria, is this true? Yes. The confirmation landed like physical weight. Diana stood up, paced to the window, came back. 12 years. Her voice was tight. You've owned a $3 billion company for 12 years and never told anyone? I built a company over 12 years. The valuation came later. You lied to us. I never lied. I just didn't volunteer information you never asked for. Marcus spoke for the first time. Victoria, you watched Diana pitch to your board. You let her be evaluated by your company, while pretending to be administrative support. I was documenting behavior that needed documentation. Diana turned sharply. So this was a test? You set me up to fail? I evaluated a potential acquisition the same way Vision Corp evaluates every acquisition. You weren't set up, you were assessed. And you decided to decline. Diana's hands clenched. My own sister rejected my company, my life's work. Because of what? Because I didn't say thank you enough? Because cultural fit was insufficient. Helen interrupted, voice shaking slightly. I still don't understand. How does Victoria have $3 billion? She worked for the government. She retired with a pension. I built Vision Corp after Richard died, used life insurance money and savings, started with government contract knowledge, grew through strategic acquisitions. Marcus studied the documents again. This says you've completed 73 acquisitions, annual revenue of 260 million, property holdings across 8 states. That's correct. And you never mentioned this. Not at Sunday dinners, not when Diana talked about her business, not when Mom worried about your finances. People hear what they expect to hear. I lived the life everyone assumed I lived because explaining otherwise required conversations no one wanted to have. Diana sat down heavily. I talked about Morrison Global at every family dinner, discussed clients, shared challenges, asked for advice, and the whole time you knew you were running something 50 times bigger. I listened. I didn't diminish what you'd built by comparing it to what I'd built. You let us feel superior. Diana's voice carried realization. You let Dad say I was the smart one. You let Mom worry about your retirement. You let everyone treat you like you'd settled for safe career because you couldn't hack it in the private sector. And it was all performance. It was survival. I met her eyes directly. If I told you 12 years ago that I was starting a company, what would you have said? Diana opened her mouth, closed it. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room. You would have explained why it wouldn't work, why government experience wasn't transferable, why I should be realistic about my limitations. You would have been kind about it, supportive even. But you would have expected failure because that fit the narrative you'd constructed about who I was. That's not that's not fair, isn't it? When I took the USAID job instead of Goldman Sachs, Dad said I wasn't competitive smart. You absorbed that assessment. Mom agreed with it. Everyone decided that settling for government work was the smart play for someone who'd rather avoid failure than chase success. I was 18. Diana's voice rose. I was a kid. You can't hold that against me forever. I don't hold it against you. But I learned from it. I learned that telling you about Vision Corp would invite judgment I didn't want. So I built it quietly, without permission, without validation, without anyone telling me I was being unrealistic. Helen spoke softly. You could have told me, your mother. And what would you have done with that information? Told Diana? Worried about whether I was getting in over my head? Offered to help in ways that assumed I needed guidance? I would have been proud. Would you? Or would you have found ways to diminish it? Call it lucky breaks. Right place at the right time. Insider information that wasn't quite ethical? Victoria, that's unfair. Helen's voice carried hurt. I've always supported you. You've always supported the version of me that made sense to you. Government worker, steady pension, modest ambitions. When I exceeded those boundaries, you didn't have framework for understanding it, so you didn't see it. Marcus interrupted. This is all history. What matters now is that you deliberately positioned yourself to evaluate Diana's company, while she had no idea you were the decision maker. That's not just deception. It's betrayal. It's exactly what due diligence requires. Objective evaluation based on documented behavior. Diana stood again, hands shaking slightly. You watched me present for 3 hours. You documented me. You recorded me. And then you declined my company based on what? How I treated you? Based on 17 behavioral patterns that revealed consistent gap between stated values and observable actions. Diana laughed, the sound bitter. So you punished me for not recognizing you were important. I evaluated whether your company could scale without fracturing. The answer was no. Because I asked you to step out during confidential discussions? Because you treat people you've categorized as non-essential the way objects get treated. Present when useful, invisible when not. You called employees fungible. You described natural ceilings for people who plateau. You interrupted your executives. You checked your phone during questions. You didn't introduce me to anyone because I wasn't important enough to merit introduction. I didn't know you were secretly a billionaire evaluating me. That's exactly my point. You didn't know. So you treated me the way you actually think about people in certain roles. Not rudely, just dismissively. The fact that I turned out to own the company doesn't change how you behaved. It just changes whether you care about the behavior. Diana stared at me, and I watched realization move across her face. This was never about the merger. This was about making me fail so you could feel superior. No, this was about maintaining standards. Vision Corp doesn't acquire companies where leadership demonstrates the kind of casual disregard for human dignity that you displayed across 2 days of observation. I demonstrated disregard for human dignity because I asked my sister to organize files and get coffee. You demonstrated disregard by treating those requests as obvious rather than considering whether they were appropriate. by never asking if I minded, by never wondering if I had anything else to contribute, by assuming my role was support because that's the role you assigned me 48 years ago. Helen stood up, voice shaking. "Stop, both of you. This is family. We don't attack each other like this." "We're not attacking." Diana's voice was cold now. "We're clarifying. Vicky has been lying by omission for 12 years, building a secret empire while letting us think she was struggling, watching us worry about her, letting us offer help she didn't need. And now we discover she rejected my company out of revenge for perceived slights. Not revenge, standards." I stood to face her directly. "You want to make this about me punishing you. That narrative is easier than examining your own behavior. But the truth is simpler. Morrison Global was evaluated using the same criteria we apply to every acquisition. You failed based on documented patterns that you created through choices you made, choices you didn't notice because you've never had to notice them. Because you never told me I was being evaluated. Leaders who need to be told they're being evaluated aren't actually leaders. They're performers who modify behavior based on audience." Diana moved closer, anger overriding caution. "You could have given me a chance, told me about Vision Corp, let me know who you were. Instead, you set up this elaborate test designed to make me look bad." "I didn't design anything. I approved due diligence on a potential acquisition." "You presented yourself exactly as you've always been. The only difference is that someone finally documented it." Marcus put his hand on Diana's arm. "Maybe we should take a break. Everyone's upset. This isn't productive." Diana shook off his hand. "No, we're finishing this." She turned back to me. "You talk about standards and documentation like this is objective business assessment. But it's not. It's personal. You've resented my success for years, resented that I built something visible while you stayed invisible. And when you finally had power, you used it to hurt me." "I didn't hurt you. I declined to acquire your company. Those are different things. They're the same thing when you're family." "No, family doesn't excuse poor behavior. It reveals it more clearly." Helen was crying quietly, and I felt guilty about that even though I'd done nothing wrong. Jessica arrived at some point, standing in the doorway with expression that suggested she'd been listening from the hallway. "Aunt Vicky." Her voice was tentative. "You really own Vision Corp?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because being underestimated is advantage. Once people know you're successful, they start making assumptions about how you got there. As long as they think you're small, they don't defend against threats they can't see. That's manipulative. That's strategic. There's a difference." Diana laughed again. Same bitter sound. And there it is, the real Victoria. Not the supportive sister, not the helpful aunt, the calculating business owner who treats family like acquisition targets. "I treat everyone consistently, that's more than you can say." "What does that mean?" "It means you're kind to clients and dismissive to staff. Respectful to people who advance your interests and casual about people who don't. You claim to value meritocracy while maintaining rigid hierarchies. You say you're direct while using euphemistic language for termination. The gap between your self-perception and your actual impact is significant enough to fail due diligence." Diana's hands trembled. "You sound like you're reading from corporate evaluation form." "I am." Catherine documented 17 patterns across 2 days. Insufficient cultural alignment with Vision Corp's operational values. Recommendation was unanimous board decline. The room absorbed this. Helen wiped her eyes. Marcus reviewed documents with expression suggesting he was looking for legal angle that didn't exist. Diana stood motionless, processing information that contradicted everything she'd believed about power dynamics in our relationship. "I'm still CEO of Morrison Global." Diana's voice was quiet now. "You declined the merger. You didn't destroy my company." "No, I just declined to associate with it. Vision Corp maintains standards. Your company doesn't meet them. That's all." "That's not all." Diana met my eyes. "You've changed how I see every interaction we've ever had. Every dinner where you stayed quiet. Every time I offered advice you didn't need. Every moment I thought I was helping my struggling older sister. It was all performance. You were always watching, always evaluating, always judging." "Not always, just when it mattered." "It always mattered." The statement hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to examine fully. 4 months passed before I saw Diana again. The break wasn't planned so much as it emerged naturally from mutual need for distance. She didn't call. I didn't reach out. Helen tried to mediate twice, gave up when neither of us showed interest in manufactured reconciliation. Vision Corp continued operating exactly as it had before the Morrison incident. We declined 2 more acquisitions during that period, both on cultural grounds that had nothing to do with my relationship with the target companies. We approved 4 others after thorough evaluation confirmed leadership that treated people with consistent dignity regardless of hierarchy. Marcus sent me a legal letter 6 weeks after the family meeting, demanding access to all evaluation materials related to Morrison Global. Paul's attorneys responded with carefully worded refusal citing confidential business assessment. Diana could threaten lawsuit, but she'd find no grounds. Due diligence materials were proprietary. Board decisions were discretionary. Nothing we'd done was actionable beyond causing hurt feelings that courts didn't remediate. I saw Jessica at a coffee shop in Arlington on a Saturday morning. She approached my table with hesitation that suggested she'd been debating whether to acknowledge me. "Aunt Vicky, can I sit?" I gestured to the empty chair. Jessica sat carefully, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she didn't drink from. "Mom's still angry, really angry. She won't talk about you, won't say your name at dinner. That's her choice." Jessica nodded. Uncle Marcus showed me the evaluation report, Catherine's documentation, the behavioral patterns. "That's confidential material." "He thought I should see it." She paused. "You weren't wrong about the patterns. I read them and recognized every one. The way Mom treats staff, how she talks about employees who don't meet her standards. I'd never thought about it before. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most people don't want to see it. Seeing it requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. I'm trying to be different." Jessica's voice was earnest. "I've been paying attention to how I talk to people, how I make decisions, whether I'm creating hierarchies or collaboration. That's growth. Mom says you betrayed her. Mom needs that narrative. It's easier than examining her behavior." Jessica sipped tea finally. "Do you miss her? Our family dinners, the way things were?" "I miss believing they might change, but I don't miss the actual dynamic. Being invisible was comfortable in some ways, but it wasn't real." "Will you ever reconcile?" "That depends on whether Diana can separate my success from her story about my limitations. Most people can't make that shift. They need you to be less, so they can be more." Jessica left after 20 minutes. I finished my coffee alone, watching people move through their Saturday mornings with problems that probably felt overwhelming, but were at least their own rather than inherited from family dynamics established decades earlier. Diana called 4 months and 3 weeks after the confrontation. Her voice carried careful neutrality that suggested she'd rehearsed. "I'm having dinner with some potential clients next Thursday. Small group, professional contacts. I wondered if you'd join us." "Why?" "Because they're interested in meeting you." Word got out about Vision Corp, about the acquisition criteria, about who owns it. People are curious. Curious about the sister who rejected your company. Curious about the businesswoman who built something significant while maintaining complete anonymity. That's impressive, regardless of our personal situation. I can't tell if you're being sincere or strategic. Both. Diana's honesty surprised me. I need to rebuild Morrison's reputation. Having you present would signal that we're past the conflict, that Vision Corp's standards are respected even when they result in declined acquisitions. You want to use my reputation to rebuild yours. I want to demonstrate that we're adults who can maintain professional relationship despite family complexity. Is that unreasonable? It's calculated. Everything's calculated. Diana's voice carried edge. You calculated for 12 years. Now I'm calculating how to move forward. We don't have to be close. We don't have to pretend nothing happened. But we can acknowledge each other's success without warfare. I attended the dinner. Small restaurant in Georgetown. 6 people including Diana and me. Conversation centered on acquisition strategies and cultural evaluation frameworks. Diana introduced me as her sister who'd built Vision Corp. No apology, no explanation. Just fact, stated plainly. She still interrupted people, still checked her phone during others' stories, still treated the waiter like furniture that occasionally brought food. But she also noticed when I observed these behaviors, made small corrections, thanked the waiter once unprompted. Small changes, insufficient for real cultural shift, but acknowledgement that awareness had developed even if transformation hadn't. Afterward, standing outside while valets retrieved cars, Diana spoke without looking at me. "I've been thinking about what you said, about treating people as objects. I don't think I do that." "Okay, But if I did, it wouldn't be intentional. It would be blind spot. Blind spots are still choices. We choose what we pay attention to. Diana finally looked at me. Do you think I can change? I think change requires believing you need to. As long as you're successful by conventional metrics, you won't feel pressure to examine behavior that enabled that success. So you think I'll never change? I think you'll change if consequences become severe enough. Decline merger might be severe enough. Or it might just be data point you rationalize away. Her car arrived. She opened the door, paused. I don't forgive you for the deception. I didn't ask for forgiveness. Good, because I'm not offering it. She left. I waited for my Honda to emerge from the underground garage, thinking about how forgiveness required believing someone had wronged you. Diana believed I'd wronged her by maintaining privacy she'd never questioned. I believe she'd wronged me by decades of casual dismissal she'd never noticed. Neither perception was wrong. They just operated from different frameworks about what family owed each other and what transparency required. The Vision Corp board convened 6 months after the Morrison situation for standard quarterly review. We evaluated pipeline opportunities with same criteria that had guided every previous assessment. Paul presented 3 potential acquisitions. Catherine provided financial analysis. Board members asked questions designed to expose cultural patterns. One company stood out: mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. Excellent financials, strong client relationships, leadership that treated junior staff with same respect given to senior executives. Evaluation revealed consistent values across all levels of organization. The discussion took 30 minutes. Every board member noted positive cultural indicators. No one raised concerns about integration challenges. When Paul called for recommendation, consensus emerged within 5 minutes. I voted to approve alongside everyone else. Professional decision based on documented evidence, the kind of decision Vision Corp made regularly without drama or family complication. After the meeting, Catherine approached me with tablets showing next quarter's evaluation targets. 2 of these have connections to people you know. She pointed to companies whose founders had worked with Diana in previous roles. Do you want to recuse yourself? No. Evaluate them normally. If they meet standards, we acquire. If not, we decline. My history with Diana doesn't change criteria. Catherine nodded. Just wanted to confirm. She left. Paul stayed, reviewing notes that didn't require immediate attention. You seem lighter. He didn't look up from his notepad. Less burdened. Diana knows now. There's relief in not maintaining performance. Are you satisfied with how it played out? Satisfied isn't the right word. But the outcome matched expectations. Diana was evaluated honestly. She failed honestly. She's angry honestly. That's progress toward reality, even if it's not progress toward reconciliation. Paul closed his notepad. You built something remarkable here. Not just the company, the culture, the standards. Most people couldn't maintain that kind of consistency. Most people need validation more than I do. That makes consistency easier or harder. Consistency without applause requires strength most people don't develop. It requires being underestimated so long that you stop caring about estimation. Paul smiled slightly. Is that what the last 12 years were about? Developing immunity to other people's opinions? Partly. Mostly it was about building something that worked exactly the way I designed it, without committee input, without family advice, without anyone telling me I was being unrealistic about my capabilities. And now I get to decide what happens next. Not Diana, not my mother, not the version of me everyone expected. Me. That's freedom. That's the whole point. I left the office as afternoon shifted toward evening. Arlington streets filled with people heading home from work, carrying briefcases and backpacks and the weight of expectations they'd internalized from others. I understood that weight, had carried it for decades, had finally set it down when I stopped requiring anyone's permission to exist as fully as I was capable of existing. Diana would rebuild Morrison Global. She was talented enough to recover from declined acquisition, but she'd rebuild with knowledge that somewhere in the world, someone had evaluated her completely and found her wanting. That knowledge would either motivate growth or justify defensiveness. I couldn't control which path she chose. What I could control was Vision Corp's continued adherence to standards that prioritized culture over capital. Every acquisition we approved validated those standards. Every decline reinforced them. Diana's situation had simply made them visible in ways that forced confrontation with questions most families avoided. My phone buzzed as I pulled into my driveway. Text from Helen. Dinner next month? Just the two of us? I'd like to talk. I responded, yes, let me know when. Small steps toward whatever relationship we'd reconstruct from the pieces of what we'd had. Not the same relationship. That was gone, but maybe something more honest, more grounded in who we actually were rather than who we'd been performing as. Inside my house, I made tea and sat in my living room. Richard's photo still occupied the mantel. His smile still captured moments I could no longer fully remember. But I remembered what he'd said about changing how people saw me being harder than becoming rich. He'd been right. Building $3 billion in assets had taken 12 years and countless hours of strategic thinking. But shifting Diana's perception had taken confrontation that felt more expensive than any financial investment. And even after that confrontation, her perception had shifted only partially. She knew I was successful. She still struggled to reconcile that success with the sister she'd decided I was. Maybe reconciliation wasn't the goal, maybe acknowledgement was sufficient. Recognition that we'd both built companies that reflected our different approaches to power, dignity, and success. Hers visible and hierarchical, mine invisible and distributed. Neither approach was wrong. They just revealed different values about what mattered when no one important was watching. I opened my laptop and reviewed tomorrow's schedule. Meeting with potential acquisition target in Baltimore. Lunch with Catherine to discuss expansion opportunities. Video call with Paul about European market assessment. All decisions that would be made based on criteria I'd established and standards I'd maintained, regardless of whether anyone ever knew my name. Being invisible had taught me that power didn't require visibility. Success didn't require applause. And respect wasn't something you demanded or negotiated. It was something you required, quietly and absolutely, by refusing to participate in systems that treated dignity as negotiable, based on someone else's assessment of your worth. Diana had assessed my worth as limited and acted accordingly. Vision Corp had assessed her culture as insufficient and acted accordingly. Both assessments were accurate within their frameworks. What Diana chose to do with that information would determine whether our relationship evolved or remained frozen in the moment she'd discovered I'd been more than she'd believed all along. But that was her choice to make. Mine was already made. I'd stopped being invisible by refusing to hide anymore. Not through dramatic revelation, but through consistent maintenance of standards that didn't bend regardless of who failed to meet them. That ultimately was the whole point. Not revenge, not vindication, just the simple truth that respect isn't owed, it's earned, but it's also chosen. I'd chosen to require it. She'd had choice about whether to give it. Business was business, family was family. And some things were non-negotiable in both.